Guess it's time for another fucking video.
Disc, my terracotta army disarms me, disowns me.
Witam towarzyszy, to jest Polinkasz, and today I'm making my 1000 subscriber special finally. I am a bit late, but fuck it, who cares? So today's topic is ideology. We're going to be going over every single major ideology, explaining its origin, and simultaneously comparing all of the ideologies at once. So before we actually get to the ideologies, I want to explain the origin of modern ideology. At the turn of the Industrial Revolution, we saw a rise in three major ideological groups: socialism, liberalism, and nationalism. Socialism is and was originally the concept that the worker should own the means of production. This is usually accompanied by collectivism, cooperation, and the abolition of private property. And to specify, private property is not the same thing as personal property. When it comes to socialist theory, there is a very important distinction between private property and personal property, and I'm going to quickly go over that. Personal property are your personal belongings, such as your TV, your toothbrush, your car, etc. Those are all examples of personal property. Private property is in relation to means of production and workplace. Socialists adamantly protect personal property. It is private property that we have a problem with, but I'll explain more about that later. Liberalism advocates for capitalism, individualism, and to some extent a wealth meritocracy. However, this usually just ends in a plutocratic system, and I'll explain more on that later. Finally, you have nationalism. Nationalism is the idea that the nation comes first, and this is usually accompanied by class collaborationism, collectivism to an extent, and Keynesian capitalism, or better known as regulated capitalism, as opposed to neoclassical capitalism, which is promoted by liberalism. I probably should have mentioned that before, but fuck it, whatever. I don't feel like going back and editing the audio. Now, these three major ideological groups would be the foundation for all ideology that would come till today. First came liberalism, shortly after came socialism, and then shortly after that came nationalism. So, I'm going to explain ideology by that order. So first, we're going to talk about classical liberalism. Now, classical liberalism is essentially based on so-called Enlightenment ideas. Now, there is another form of liberalism called Enlightenment liberalism, but I have yet to see any real difference from Enlightenment liberalism and classical liberalism. To continue, classical liberalism essentially advocates for a neoclassical Smithian type economy, which holds the Enlightenment concept of individualism, meritocracy, and minimal state involvement in society. Many of these so-called conservatives of today can be labeled as classical liberals. That's not to say that all modern conservatives are classical liberals. It's just that some of them, if not most of them, are. Classical liberalism can fall under a branch of liberalism that I like to call the value-based liberalism that emphasizes the importance of liberal values. Before I continue on to the other value-based liberalism ideologies, there are two other branches of liberalism. You have freedom-based liberalism and progress-based liberalism, and I will go into more detail on those later. But anyway, to continue on value-based liberalism. Next is conservatism. Now, conservatism takes this on another level, protecting not only liberal values, but also traditional values, the importance of keeping and protecting the ideals of previous generations. In every other regard, they're pretty much the same as classical liberalism. They just have a bigger hard-on for traditional values. However, on occasion, conservatives will use Keynesian economics, while classical liberals refuse Keynesianism as a revision of original liberalism. And last, we have national conservatism, which is pretty much just conservatism except with an added nationalism, a added focus on the value of one's nation. This is an example of when an ideology can actually cross over between two major ideological groups. In this example, it is nationalism and liberalism, although national conservatism is more liberal than it is nationalism. An example of a national conservative being Putin. Moving on to the next branch of liberalism is freedom-based liberalism. These are ideologies dedicated to their interpretation of freedom and care less about liberal values and progress. The first freedom-based liberal ideology I'm going to talk about is libertarianism. Libertarianism is based on the idea that the markets and the economy must be completely and absolutely without state intervention. They are absolutely sold on the Smithian concept of the invisible hand guiding the capitalist economy for the benefit of all. They're a lot like classical liberals, except far more laissez-faire in their economics. The next ideology I'm going to talk about is social liberalism. Social liberalism differs from libertarianism by, rather than focusing on economic freedom, it focuses on social freedom. In fact, social liberalism usually prefers Keynesian economics over neoclassical economics like libertarianism does. However, they believe that the state should have no intervention in the social aspect of society. In a way, social liberalism can be thought of a lot like centrism. Those are pretty much the only two major freedom-based liberal ideologies, so now I'm going to move on to the progress-based liberal ideologies. First, I'm going to talk about social democracy. Social democracy is essentially a leftist deviation of liberalism, more focused on the benefit of the working class and the regulation of capitalism and the restriction on the wealthy class. This may seem good and all at first glance. However, modern Marxists like to dub social democracy as fascism light, because they essentially promote the same things that fascists do: class collaboration, Keynesian economics, having the right people in the government, and reforming capitalism to make it a better system. These are all characteristics of fascist ideology. Not to mention that social democrats have, on numerous occasions, repressed socialist revolutions. And the next ideology is progressive liberalism, or more commonly known as progressivism. Progressivism, or progressive liberalism, is a lot like social liberalism, except slightly farther left, as well as environmentalism usually being a core basis of their ideology. And that concludes progress-based liberal ideology. There are also other uncategorizable forms of liberalism, such as paleo-libertarianism, which is essentially a more conservative approach to regular libertarianism. And then there is also neoliberalism, which is an ultra-expansion of neoclassical capitalism. And then there's also neoconservatism, which is just one step down from fascism, essentially. I may have to go over neoliberalism and neoconservatism in more detail in another video. However, I will not do so in this video as to not make it too long. So next we're going to move on to socialist ideologies. Socialism, in my view, is divided into two major categories: communism and anarchism. Communism is based on Marxism, which is essentially a scientific form of socialism, while anarchism is a more utopian and unscientific form of socialism. That's not to say the utopian socialists and anarchists are the same thing, but they do have a lot of similarities. So first I'm going to go over communist ideologies. So, communist ideology is essentially based mainly on the writings and works of Marx and Engels. They scientifically explained the exploitation of the proletariat and the relativity of the means of production between classes, as well as scientifically prove the inefficiencies and the eventual downfall of capitalism. The basis of communist or Marxist ideology is essentially that capitalism inherently has crises, and eventually the crises will get so bad that there will be a revolution in which the capitalist system will be overthrown, and in place there will be a socialist system which will lead to a higher phase socialist or communist system where class capital and the state will wither away. So first of the communist ideologies that should be discussed is classical Marxism. Classical Marxism is quite literally exactly what it sounds like. It is just basic Marxism without any expansion. Although there aren't many classical Marxists left, you can find some of them occasionally. Now, moving on to the big boys are, first, Marxism-Leninism. Now, Marxism-Leninism is Lenin's expansion of Marxist theory. Lenin contributed theories such as the Vanguard, which is a group of intellectuals that are supposed to lead the proletariat through revolution when revolution comes, as well as democratic centralism, which is the idea that once a democratic consensus has come to fruition, that consensus must be followed to its end. This was created to prevent factionalism and splits within the Revolutionary Party. This is also accompanied by the directly democratic Soviet system, which was envisioned by Lenin and was established in Stalin's time. For more info on Marxism-Leninism, please check out my other video, Basics of Marxism-Leninism, featuring Finnish Bolshevik. Next is Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, which is an expansion of Marxism-Leninism by Mao. Maoism is Maoism expands Leninism to fit the material conditions of China better by adding concepts such as the mass line, which is the Vanguard Party's direct communication and interaction with the revolutionary proletariat, which was in China mostly peasants, as well as New Democracy, which essentially says that sometimes in socialist revolution it is necessary to team up with nationalists or other reactionary forces to be able to combat the main enemy, which is the capitalist bourgeoisie. Mao also came up with Protracted People's War, which is essentially a form of guerrilla warfare where the peasantry surrounds the cities and choke the bourgeoisie until they are forced to leave. This worked extremely efficiently as I said before, the majority of China was peasantry and farmland and such. And then you have Cultural Revolution, which is the idea of combating bourgeois tendencies even after the revolution is over. And that pretty much sums up Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, which now brings me to Marxism-Leninism-Hojism, which is a rejection of Maoism and is hyper-focused on preventing revisionism within the ideology of Marxism-Leninism. I'm not too educated on Hojism. All I know is that it is an ideology created by Hoxha, who was an extreme anti-revisionist. And then you have Luxemburgism, which is essentially a... Fuck me. Anyway, as I was saying, Luxemburgism is essentially a more decentralized take on Marxist revolution and socialism in general. Rosa Luxemburg wanted the revolution to be less focused on a vanguard and more focused on a collective, decentralized revolution of the workers. And once the revolution was over, she advocated for a general election, so to speak. And the last of the major Marxist ideologies, we have left communism, which essentially says that Leninism and all of its expansions are revisions of Marxism that are statist or authoritarian in a way. Left communists generally say that Marxism-Leninism and all of its expansions is a right-wing deviation of Marxism, and that they are the true Marxists as they don't make any compromises for material conditions. They also claim that vanguardism, democratic centralism, and the Soviet system and bureaucracy are all just examples of red fascism. This concludes part 1 of 2 on the description of various ideologies. I will see you, comrades, next week.